I think the key thing is we're looking at technologies that are not the same as ours.
Yes.
And that's partly why archaeologists can't see them.
The Serapeum in Sakkara is one of the greatest mysteries of ancient Egypt. And that is meant quite literally, because almost ridiculously large objects, estimated to weigh up to 100 tons, are indeed slumbering in this underground tomb. The oversized granite boxes are commonly interpreted as sarcophagi, but there are those who believe that this interpretation has nothing to do with historical reality. Instead, the Serapeum would lead directly to an almost unbelievable realization that stops at nothing, from futuristic technologies to bodily giants. But how should we evaluate such outlandish theories? And could it ultimately be that there is more truth to them than we would like to admit? When we think of archaeological excavations, we immediately think of professional experts carefully and patiently uncovering the hidden treasures of the past. However, the historical searches of the past centuries were not always quite so prissy. On the contrary, if you like, dynamite was once part of every researcher's standard equipment as a practical door opener. And Auguste Mariette also knew how to make a disruptive barrier instantly forgotten. In 1852, after the French Egyptologist had noticed some strange artifacts at bazaars, he searched for their origin and discovered access to a tomb near the Dozier Pyramid. Apparently, the grave robbers had not managed to track down the hidden site in the last 3,000 years, and so it came about that Mariette sensed countless untouched treasures of inestimable value inside the site. And indeed, the Frenchman's assumptions seemed to be confirmed immediately, because behind the entrance to the tomb, he was greeted by a statue of an Apis bull. Further figures and stelae of the sacred bull were lying on the ground next to it. No wonder, since in ancient Egypt, the Apis was considered the earthly embodiment of the god Ptah, who is said to have created man from clay. And with this knowledge in the back of their mind, Mariette came to the conclusion that he had just opened the gate of the so-called Serapeum. In other words, the gate of a millennia-old burial and cult site for the very same supernatural bulls that Greek historians had already mentioned in their records around the year 25 BC. It is doubtful, however, that Mariette had any ancient Greek historians in mind at that moment. Instead, he continued on his way through the nested underground site and a little later came upon the untouched tomb of Chemawasset, a son of Ramses II, who lived from about 1281 to 1225 BC. And what was understandably an absolute sensation at the time seems only logical in retrospect. After all, Chemawasset had already held an important position as a priest in the Apis cult at a young age, and in the same breath had also ordered the construction of the Serapeum in Sakkara. Mariette, however, had his own way of dealing with the irreplaceable testimonies of the inhabitants of the Pharaonic Empire. He had all of the approximately 7,000 grave goods transferred to his home country, where many of them can still be admired in the Louvre today. The Tomb of the Giants? Once the tomb of Chemawasset had been stripped of its contents, it was time for Mariette to leave the so-called small gallery and advance to the lower levels of the Serapeum. When he arrived at the large gallery, the Frenchman saw another 24 niches, but these had been walled up, which was strange. The protruding walls were adorned with steels covered with hieroglyphics, but Mariette wanted to know what was hidden behind the walls, and so he had the walls demolished without further ado. And then he couldn't believe his eyes. 22 of the 24 niches contained fully grown colossi, gigantic granite sarcophagi that eclipsed all known counterparts. But that wasn't all. On the massive coffin lids, there were also several layers of smaller stone blocks, as if someone had tried to weigh the lids down even more. And while 2 of the 24 objects were mysteriously enthroned in the side passages of the Serapeum, the sarcophagi had always been carved out of a single block of granite. The question of how the ancient Egyptians managed to work such a hard material at all with the means available to them at the time is still one of the most perplexing for historical research. And yet, it sometimes takes a back seat in view of the incredible dimensions of the coffins. Mariette's compatriot and companion, the engineer Louis Lenant de Belfons, measured one of the granite giants and concluded that it weighed at least 65 tons. He calculated that a second one weighed more than 70 tons. And while today's estimates suggest that the sarcophagi of the Serapeum could weigh up to 80 tons, other experts believe that they may even break the 100-ton mark. This raises the inevitable question of who, or what, was laid to rest in such enormous sarcophagi. There is no question that it must have been something very large, since the granite coffins not only weigh many tons, but are also usually over 2 meters wide and high, and almost twice as long. This time, however, Marriott did not have to resort to dynamite or other equally radical means to catch a glimpse of the interior of the objects. Almost all of the coffin lids, which weigh 20 tons, as much as 3 African elephants, had been pushed to the side. The Apis bull tomb without Apis bulls. So what did Marriott see when he looked through the slits into the sarcophagi? Well, nothing at all. All the opened coffins were completely empty, and it is in the nature of things that we Frenchmen and his companions were surprised, to put it mildly, by this fact. Because as we recall, the tomb of Chemawaset was completely intact. So why would the grave robbers have ignored the countless treasures just to climb deeper into the vaults, push aside the coffin lids, which weighed tons, and plunder the contents? And apart from that, there were no traces here that suggested that someone had forcibly entered the site and robbed it of its treasures. However, if this was the case, the grave robbers did not complete their work because they forgot one sarcophagus. In fact, one of the containers was still untouched and sealed, and Marriott's team initially tried unsuccessfully to push aside the lid with pure muscle power. In the end, the good old dynamite had to be consulted once again to help the archaeological research along. But one explosion and a hole in the coffin lid later, Marriott discovered that this sarcophagus was also empty, and the mystery was only getting bigger. And if you like, the mystery remains to this day, although not a single Apis bull has been found in the Serapeum. It is still considered to be an ancient Egyptian Apis bull tomb. According to the prevailing doctrine, the sacred animals were kept and worshipped in the above-ground stables. After their death, they were finally elaborately embalmed and buried in the vault below ground. But how is it then that there is no trace of the Apis bulls? Well, the conservative researchers answer this with, it is not. After the Serapeum was closed by order of the Roman Empress Honorius, Coptic monks are said to have destroyed a large number of the bull mummies in order to put an end to the Apis cult. The skeptical side wonders how the monks could have dragged the bodies through the narrow slits, and why they even bothered to completely reseal the coffins afterwards. And even outside the Serapeum in Sakkara, not a single mummy of an Apis bull has been discovered to date, but written records show that the Egyptians practiced a great cult of Apis, which is considered historically certain. For example, the death of an Apis bull was marked by a 70-day period of national mourning, during which the cult followers let their hair grow, did not wash, and uttered painful lamentations. And they would certainly have uttered painful lamentations if they had known what their descendants would do with the sacred Apis objects. In fact, shortly before the rediscovery of the Serapeum, Apis bull canoptic jars had been offered for sale at local markets. These are the vessels in which the entrails of the animals were buried separately from the corpse. The question of the true purpose. But before we misunderstand each other, strictly speaking, bulls were buried in the Serapeum, but not Apis bulls. Mummified bull corpses were actually found in the small gallery, but as already mentioned, they were not worshipped as Apis bulls. And, moreover, they rested in wooden sarcophagi and not in monstrous granite structures. And against this background, the question arises for one or the other alternative-minded person why the ancient Egyptians really went to the trouble of carving out granite objects weighing dozens of tons, the material for which also had to be transported hundreds of kilometers from Aswan. In view of the stones on the lids, which act as additional weights, some people even think it conceivable that nothing was buried here, but rather was in fact meant to be locked away forever. What these creatures might have been, and where they ultimately ended up, is another matter entirely. Some alternative historians draw a connection to the Bible at this point, to the giant Nephilim that once rampaged across the earth, according to the Holy Scripture. And possibly, according to the highly controversial theory, the Egyptians later simply adopted the much older Nephilim coffins and reused them for their own purposes. And even if we move away from biblical giants and leave aside the missing content for a moment, the design of the sarcophagi is a great mystery. While the stonemasons precisely crafted the interior of the objects and created edges with exactly 90-degree angles, the outer appearance, with its dense, crooked surfaces and slanted edges, appears strangely careless. And then there are the hieroglyphic inscriptions, which have been identified in 3 of the 24 coffins, and enigmatically named kings from the 26th and 27th dynasties. So, we are roughly talking about a period between 600 and 400 BC, and thus several centuries after the era of Chemawesset, who, as already mentioned, is said to have commissioned the construction of the Serapeum. Last but not least, there is also the assumption that the objects were not sarcophagi at all, but gigantic batteries. Strange illustrations such as the so-called light bulbs of Dendera feed the idea in certain circles that the ancient Egyptians possessed technologies that were in no way inferior to our own. And in the case of the Serapeum, the granite giants are said to have been used to generate electric charges by building up pressure inside them using CO2 gas. In detail, the pressure exerted on the quartz crystals is said to have generated electrical charges that were scattered from the underground to the Earth's surface and transformed the sky over the Sakkara into an ionized glowing light spectacle. And now we are looking forward to your clicks. We'll be happy to click our thumbs and the subscribe button so we never miss a new video from you again. See you soon!